Is the whip ready?
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. I'll give the front bench a few minutes to swap over.
Thank you very much. Well done, me. Well done. Congratulations again.
Is your event still going on?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Lovely. People can leave quickly and... No. Don't walk past the dispatch box. You've been told a number of times. Go back. The question is that this House do now adjourn, and I call the member Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to register on behalf of my constituents in Mid Buckinghamshire my outrage at the unacceptable situation that all of my constituents are facing, a tidal wave of energy infrastructure driven by hype, speculation and a closed-minded approach to energy security. Just as we have seen with countless other large-scale infrastructure projects, be it road, rail or indeed housing, it is rural areas that are thrown under the bus with no thought for the huge impact that both construction and operation of these projects has on communities. I would therefore strongly encourage the government to take note of what I believe is a ticking time bomb that risks not just permanently devastating my constituency, but countless others across the United Kingdom. I am sadly no stranger to the problem of big infrastructure. From the moment I was first elected, I have taken every opportunity to put on record the terrible destruction that HS2 has brought on my constituency, from the shameless turfing out of farmers, often leaving them without compensation for years on end, to the sorry state of the roads used by HGVs, and the sheer size of the compounds that litter the Buckinghamshire countryside, literally industrial waste, for there is no justification for spending £200 billion of taxpayers' money on a railway that has effectively already become obsolete. And the same is true of the ground-based energy infrastructure, the least efficient form of energy production. Put simply, the enormous loss of agricultural land required to double today's share of national energy consumption that is generated by solar, amounting to less than 10%, even with this increase proposed, is simply not worth it. It would not be an adjournment debate without... I'm interested to see how my honourable friend gets Mid Buckinghamshire into his intervention, but I'm all ears.
But Mr. Shanks, this is about energy development proposals in Mid Buckinghamshire.
I know it is.
We're ready for your intervention.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman has put forward for Mid Buckinghamshire has put forward the importance of land. The priority for good land, good agricultural land, is to provide the food to feed this nation. It isn't necessary to put forward solar energy projects which then clog and take away the land. My constituency is the same as his, and because of that, my interest is to ensure that the good land is kept for the production of food as it should be.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He is always on point on these matters, and I will come to the very important points of food security later in my speech, but to put on the record in answer directly to him, he is absolutely right, and it is the inefficiency of some of the energy projects we are seeing coming forward in Mid Buckinghamshire, as well as communities, I dare say, in Strangford, that is a huge challenge to not just food security, but the very rural way of life that those of us in communities like Mid Buckinghamshire and I dare say Strangford enjoy. Now, when it takes, Madam Deputy Speaker, 2,000 acres of solar panels to generate enough electricity to power on current usage, before everyone has 2 Teslas on the drive, 50,000 homes of current usage, but a small modular reactor requires just 2 football pitches to produce enough power on current usage for 1 million homes, it cannot be right that the government is pursuing this technology. Nuclear, I would put it to the Minister and honourable and right honourable members across the House, is the answer, but fingers seem to be in ears whenever it is raised. I would have assumed that this is obvious to the government, as would the vital importance of food security, which is directly compromised by taking land out of food production and giving it over to solar. The government seems content with ploughing on. Last week's revelation in the Telegraph of intentions to convert a tenth of our farmland to use for net zero gives a blank cheque to those intent on destroying rather than preserving our countryside. The countryside is for farming. It is not a building site for solar panels or power plants or battery storage or wind turbines. It is for growing food. It is for the local communities and businesses that rely on it. And the attempts to take away land from food production in my constituency are simply unjustifiable. An unjustifiable 3,000 acres of land already lost or is at risk of being subsumed by solar panels. 3,000 acres being taken out of food production. 3,000 acres that is no longer farmed by families who farmed it for generations, now turfed out with little or no compensation. The land unlikely ever to return to food production. And keep in mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is just for the current projects proposed or consented. Take Rosefield, a monster project of immense scale. Over 2,000 acres of land for this monstrosity alone, much of it arable grade 3A, 3B, being sold off to EDF Renewables for the construction of vast swathes of solar panels right in the heart of the Claydons. Land that regularly produces a 10-tonne a hectare wheat harvest. That is a wheat harvest that many farmers would bite your right hand off to actually get, but it is cast aside by the consultants and the people that come along trying to propose this site as low-grade land. It simply is not. As the name suggests, this area is rich in clay soil, incredibly valuable to farmers as it retains rich levels of both nutrients and water. It's what allows us in Buckinghamshire to produce immense quantities of wheat, barley, beans and oilseed rape and much, much more. Yet we're facing a clear trade-off between food security and what is considered today to be energy security. Members will know that I've consistently questioned the suitability and sustainability of solar as a renewable source of electricity. There is nothing renewable about land left to rot underneath solar panels. There is nothing renewable about the huge amount of emissions used in the construction of these vast sites. We in Buckinghamshire face an equal, if not greater, threat from what are called battery energy storage sites. These shipping container-sized units use hundreds of lithium-ion batteries to store surplus energy, which is later sold back to the grid to meet demand when required. These battery storage sites are not only noisy and unsightly, they displace water runoff because of their concrete bases. They create light pollution, they are a target for vandalism, and they are a huge fire risk, which I will come on to shortly. And on top of all of that, these are, I'm afraid to say, not a sustainable form of energy production, because these sites are doing nothing more than holding surplus energy, no matter how or where that energy has actually been generated. In fact, with less than 5% of today's energy consumption coming from solar, chances are this energy has not come from the site next door. It is utterly shameful of BESS promoters to label their projects as sustainable and part of the solution. I'm afraid to say it is simply a matter of profiteering off the taxpayer while doing little to nothing. That is, unless you enjoy a chemically fuelled bonfire, because it has been proven time and time again with tragic results how dangerous BESSs can be. For example, in September 2020, a fire at a BESS site in Liverpool took 59 hours to extinguish. And whilst the promoters may spout new technology guarding us against fire today, this does not and cannot justify placing BESSs in rural areas. Because, surprise, surprise, it takes far longer for fire crews to respond in rural areas, especially ones that are prone to flooding, such as the Claydons in my constituency, where three BESS applications have been lodged in just 1 year. It's not surprising that pouring concrete onto farmland exacerbates flooding. It is not surprising that hundreds of shipping containers ruin the view from miles around.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I'd be delighted to give.
Joe Morrissey.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. Not only do these energy development proposals create a strain on our valuable farmland in Mid Buckinghamshire and across Buckinghamshire, but equally we are in a floodplain in many parts of Buckinghamshire, which will already be put under additional strain because of these different energy development proposals. And do you think the minister look again at these proposals, because we also have infrastructure demands for both HS2, housing and energy development, all going into a very constrained area in Mid Buckinghamshire?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend and fellow Buckinghamshire Member of Parliament for that intervention, and she is absolutely right that the strain being put on our small rural county from so many projects, the cumulative impact of the energy proposals that is the subject of my speech tonight, but also HS2 and East West Rail and mega prisons and so much more, makes the attack on our countryside and makes the risk, particularly to the point she makes on flooding, all the worse. I just gave a list of things that should not be surprising, but it does seem surprising to promoters who seem totally oblivious to the idea that farming gives us food, gives people jobs and a livelihood, gives communities an identity and a vital source of income. But that seemingly hasn't stopped those promoters from flooding the planning system in Mid Buckinghamshire with these BESS applications. And what makes it all the more confusing is, according to the government's newly formed National Energy Systems Operator, the number of speculative connection applications has substantially risen over the past few years, resulting in an excessively high volume of contracted parties, when in reality only about a third of the volume of those projects will make it to completion. So what we actually see, and the point I'm making, which is very visible in Mid Buckinghamshire, is a number of these so-called zombie projects that are clogging up the system, causing incredible concern and outrage to local communities that may actually never happen. And that, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is simply absurd. My constituents are constantly being told that these projects are needed for a transition to net zero, yet the vast majority of them will not even be completed. This goes to show how misguided the government's so-called energy security policy really is, unable to deliver and throwing my constituents under the bus in the first place. It should therefore not be a surprise that the misguided and highly speculative nature of these BESS projects has led to countless rejections by local planning authorities. Less than 6 weeks ago, when presented with their first BESS application, a 500 megawatt site in the Claydons, Buckinghamshire Council resoundingly rejected it on the grounds of fire risk, lack of access and an inappropriate site location. Our local paper even described the plan as a terrorist's dream. The same goes for York Council, which rejected a 100 megawatt site in the village of Osbaldwick on fire grounds, which for the same reason led East Renfrewshire Council rejecting a 40 megawatt site in the village of Eaglesham in Scotland, and for Dorset Council's rejection of a 60 megawatt facility in the village of Chickerell. I trust the Minister shall have taken notice of not just these rejections, but the many others which are, if anything, increasing by the week. This, I hope, demonstrates the clear, strong opposition from local communities to these BESS facilities. But it is not just, Madam Deputy Speaker, about battery storage or solar farms or substations or whatever else forms part of the government's flawed approach to energy security. For constituencies like mine, it's about the cumulative impact of all of this and more, which time and time again the local community has little, if any, say over at all. For my constituents, again in the Claydons, nearly every major project has been government sanctioned, with little to no thought as to how, when you combine one of the largest solar installations in the United Kingdom, 3 battery storage sites, 2 major new railways, a new substation and several new housing developments, a collection of small villages in the middle of the countryside is meant to cope. The short answer is they haven't. Initially faced with both East West Rail and HS2 construction, the latter still ongoing and will do so for many years to come, my constituents in that part of Buckinghamshire now face a raft of new energy infrastructure as well as yet more housing and a new prison. The cumulative impact really is devastating, made worse by the fact that there is no mechanism within the planning system that allows cumulative impact of major multiple infrastructure projects in the same area to be accounted for when local authorities are presented with them. It seems logical, yet the Minister must recognise there is no circumstance which necessitates the flattening of an area that serves no benefit for local residents to leave them in a near permanent state of disruption and misery. The latest example of this glaring omission is the application and subsequent rejection of Statera's plan to build a 500 megawatt BESS facility in the Claydons that I spoke of a few moments ago. It turns out that the promoters didn't check that they could even get a grid connection upon completion, as confirmed by the National Grid when pressed on that substation expansion plan before Christmas. This is yet more evidence of the speculative nature of government-backed infrastructure projects. Just as well with Statera's plans having now been rejected. Elsewhere in my constituency, yet another solar installation at Callis Farm in Ilmer, Callis Farm near Ilmer, was recently granted planning permission, joining 2 other nearby sites at Bumpers Farm and Wilbrush Farm in Kingsey. As a result, when you enter Buckinghamshire on the train from neighbouring Oxfordshire, you are met not with farmland, but with acres upon acres of solar panels. Further south and directly affecting my constituents in Little Missenden, we find yet another potential BESS site at Mop End, which if built would require infrastructure reaching 6 metres in height, right in the heart of the Chilterns. In Long Crendon and the surrounding villages, I and the local community are fighting against Acorn Bioenergy's proposed anaerobic digester, which once again cannot be justified in the middle of the countryside, not when there are 140 lorry movements a day during construction and then through operation, through villages that, and I will declare an interest, my own village of Cheersley is included amongst that, simply cannot cope and cannot be expected to cope. Small rural villages where those small rural roads often have the front doors to people's homes, the entranceways to primary schools, the entranceways to children's playgrounds, right off those very same roads. I will give way briefly to my humble friend.
My honourable friend is making a very excellent point about the shocking amount of development that is happening, and it's not just energy, but my honourable friend is making an excellent point about the lack of local consent, and it is shocking that the government is not honouring the opinions of local people.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She makes exactly the point that I want to make, perhaps more succinctly than I have been able to manage, that this is about local consent. This is about communities giving their views and actually being listened to when it comes to these projects, because far too often the desktop exercise that is done in London or Birmingham or Leeds or Manchester or any of our great cities is largely done by those that have no or little understanding of rural life, of the way our rural roads actually operate, the way our farmland is actually farmed, the way our countryside actually works. And if local people were listened to a little bit more often, we might not have some of the problems that these energy infrastructure projects, or otherwise like HS2 or East West Rail, throw up. The land that any local will tell you floods 3 or 4 times a year, but the desktop exercise says, oh, that's nothing, that's nowhere near a floodplain. That land won't flood. But I've stood there in my own Wellington boots a number of times on many of these sites, and the land that the consultants in the cities say won't flood with it lapping up at the top of my boots and going home with wet socks. It is a reality that local people often understand in a way that these consultants and desktop exercises never would. And I gently invite the Minister to acknowledge that no matter how sustainable these projects claim to be, the hard truth is that whether it be during construction or operation of these sites, transportation of materials effectively offsets any benefit and does permanent damage to a local area, just as it has done with HS2. Just this week, I've objected to yet another BESS application in the Claydons, where the developer has not even bothered to include a battery safety management plan. It is utterly disgraceful and a reflection of just how speculative these applications are becoming. Despite this speculation on solar and battery storage, wherever you go in Buckinghamshire, there are few, if any, warehouse roofs with solar panels. A real shame considering the amount of unused roof space which could generate 15 gigawatts of solar-derived energy without damaging a blade of grass or any crop growing in any field. This is equivalent to 46 million solar panels. Why, therefore, is the government not actively incentivising the use of large-scale roof-mounted solar, particularly on industrial buildings, these distribution centres and warehouses and factories that we see popping up all around us, certainly near to me as you go out towards Bicester or up towards Milton Keynes? A question that is rightly asked by farmers across my constituency who stand to lose everything when a solar developer comes along, or indeed any energy project with little or no compensation. This is, I'm afraid to say, fairly typical at this point when it comes to infrastructure, especially in rural areas where a farm is not just a source of income, but someone's livelihood and the very shape and beauty of the landscape in rural communities. And when it comes to a project the size of Rosefield, which primarily affects tenant farmers, the loss of income, not just for individual farmers, but the whole area, is devastating. That's because, unlike a freeholder, in this case, the Claydon estate, tenant farmers do not have ownership rights and are therefore not entitled to proper compensation. This is despite this and other sizable projects being spearheaded by large multinational energy companies for whom compensation is normally just a rounding error. And it's not just farmers. Unpaid parish councillors across my constituency are spending ever more time fighting this infrastructure tidal wave. I dare say many have become rather good at it, following years of doing battle with HS2. But this by no means justifies thousands of hours each year being spent by countless individuals, countless heroes, sometimes combined with significant sums of money, fighting projects that local residents don't want and did not ask for. They, along with farmers and local business owners, are paying the price for this nonsensical approach to energy security. And for projects that are given the go-ahead, there is little chance of promoters paying up for the damage they will invariably do to our local road network. This is a sad reality for infrastructure projects, as we have seen with the countless others I have referenced, though I am proud the work I and Buckinghamshire Council did to push East West Rail to pay up for the damage they caused. There is no such prospect with energy infrastructure. But the fact is, with so many sites in one area, the impact on our roads from all that construction traffic would be far worse than any one promoter is prepared to admit. So much of that, just as we have seen with those railways and highways works clash, it delays all projects in the area, ultimately costing the taxpayer and prolonging the misery for my constituents. This is the reality. And if something isn't done, we will lose our ability to produce food. We will see the continued erosion of rural communities, all while doing little to source our energy sustainability. Energy infrastructure does not belong on farmland. It does not belong in Mid Buckinghamshire. Let's drop this nonsense and go for nuclear instead.
I call the Minister, Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for securing this debate this evening. It's certainly not been an adjournment debate lacking in hyperbole. And I look forward to responding to his specific points in my summing up. I think the ticking time bomb and intent on destroying and thrown under the bus suggests that we've taken a rational view to some of these decisions, although I would say the 2 Teslas in the drive comment suggests our constituencies are quite different, and perhaps that will come forward in my remarks. I want to just pick up on the general thrust of his speech before I turn to some of the specifics. And I think the general sort of tone, I think, puts forward a case that quite wrongly asserts that the only options here are either a clean power system with renewables at the heart or nuclear. And actually, I agree with him, and I'll come on to the point about SMRs shortly, that the rational case is, of course, for balance in this. And we do see nuclear as playing a really critical role in our energy system in the future. But we also see that in order to build out a clean power system, we need to build renewables as part of that as well, because they are cheaper to operate and they deliver homegrown energy security in a way that gas plants at the moment do not. And so I'll come back to some of the Clean Power Action Plan's pathway in due course. The truth is, I think the Honourable Gentleman has spent the past 20 minutes outlining, and in fact he was quite open and honest about this, that he wants no infrastructure built in his constituency at all. And yet I assume his constituents do still want to be able to rely on that infrastructure in their daily lives, in railways, in hospitals, in schools, in energy, and indeed in prisons as well, where I think the Honourable Gentleman and certainly his colleagues certainly want us to use prisons much more, but don't want us to build prisons anywhere in his constituency. And I think the problem is, at the heart of this is, and I'm always very careful about the arguments about NIMBYism, but I think at the heart of this is a real question about, at some point we have to acknowledge, if we're going to build infrastructure in this country, it has to be hosted somewhere. And I'm afraid, as someone who has one of Europe's biggest onshore wind farms just outside my window in my constituency, I recognise the importance that some constituencies will have to host important infrastructure on behalf of the country, and I think we all need to play a part in that, because the reality is our energy system at the moment, to deliver energy security, requires us to build much more, even if that is small modular reactors. But by 2050, the estimates are that demand for electricity in this country will double. And so the need for all our constituents, including the Honourable Gentleman's constituents, for electricity and for the jobs of the future will mean building much more infrastructure. If I take the point that I thought he made that is actually important, it is around the cumulative impact. And I do think this is a really important point that the government has tried to wrestle with. It's partly why we launched the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, so that we actually do have a holistic approach to planning the energy system in the long term. I think that work should have been started a long time ago, but it wasn't by the previous government. And of course, alongside that, colleagues in DEFRA have launched the Land Use Framework for partly the same reason, to try and really plan what is the long-term future for land across our country. How do we protect land for food, because food security is incredibly important, but also where do we identify places of land where we'll build nationally important infrastructure, and that is incredibly important. And so I repeat the point that we do need to build infrastructure in this country. I'm afraid we've buried our head in the sand for far too long on some of the infrastructure that's necessary, and the grid is struggling as a result. But I think finding a way to do that in a holistic way that does recognise the cumulative impact on communities is really important, and I want him to appreciate that. I do recognise that point. On the issue around the grid itself, he noted a number of projects that are in the queue to connect. I think at the moment it sits around 746 gigawatts in that queue. I would gently say that the reason that queue has got quite so out of control is because the previous government didn't manage that queue properly. There wasn't reform sufficiently enough to manage that queue. And so we do have this situation where there are, as he said, a number of zombie projects in the queue that are never actually going to be developed but are taking up a connections queue in that. We've announced that we want to have quite a significant reform of that to make sure we're prioritising the projects that will actually be delivered, that are important for our energy security, and crucially that free up space for demand projects to be connected to the grid, which is important for our economic growth. And there'll be more announced from that from NISO and Ofgem in due course. If I maybe just turn to some of the specific points that he raised. some of these he won't be surprised to hear. I can't give a specific answer on because for legal reasons I've got to be careful not to comment. But on Rosefield, the solar farm which you mentioned is in pre-application stage. The application for development consent is expected to be submitted in Q3 or Q4, I think, of this year. And of course, at this point, it's developer-led. And I think on a number of the points he raised today, I would say, first of all, the government doesn't go out and identify these projects. Developers identify these projects, and they then have a conversation with landowners about exactly how. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way on that point, but specifically to the argument he's trying to construct. Every time a developer comes along with a proposal and the pushback comes back from the community, why are you doing this? The answer every single time is always because the government are asking us to. And that is what frustrates communities and myself every single time. And if he'll accept that that is the excuse being given by developers, he can either correct them and say, no, the government's not asking you to do this, or find a way to challenge some of those presumptions and the cumulative impacts that I'm grateful to him for saying he wants to address.
Well, I think I take the point, but I would just say that, yes, the government absolutely does say that we need to build a clean power system, and therefore these projects are important. What we don't do is go out and say, please build a solar wind farm in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency. That's what I'm suggesting, is that these are developer-led projects. They identify the site. On the question of land ownership, of course, the government isn't in the business of appropriating land for energy projects. The landowner themselves have made a decision to sell their land for these projects, and that's a relationship that they have with the developer. And so it's a developer-led process. I know that the Honourable Gentleman will, of course, continue to provide his views as the process continues, and if the application in Rosefields is accepted by the Planning Inspectorate, of course, the Honourable Member and all of his constituents will be able to engage in the planning process to register as interested parties. And I think I just want to reiterate the point that although this government thinks the planning system could be considerably more efficient, it is not about removing the robustness of that system so that communities no longer have a voice. We want communities to have a voice in this process, but we don't want them to be hanging around for years until decisions are made. So we want the process to be more efficient, but that communities should absolutely still have a voice, and that's incredibly important. If the application at that point then comes to the Secretary of State, it's the duty of the Secretary of State to be satisfied that the consultation process, the pre-application consultation process, has been carried out properly and adequately in compliance with the Planning Act 2008. And of course, I know the Honourable Gentleman will appreciate that given my department's quasi-judicial role in these applications, I can't comment on anything more specific. On the point around batteries, I think he raised a number of points here. Battery storage is incredibly important. In order to build the clean power system we need a mix of both short-duration storage, which batteries provide, and also long-duration storage, which we haven't built in this country for an extremely long time. We've announced that we will build new long-duration storage, but we also know that there is a really important role for batteries to play in that short-duration storage so that we can store the clean power that's generated from wind and solar for when we need it. Of course, these projects will go through the planning process as well. The East Claydon point that I think he mentioned, I'm aware that it's been rejected by the local council. Of course, the applicant then has a right to appeal. And again, I hope the Honourable Gentleman understands it would be wrong for me to comment on that particular case in this point. On the point about batteries more generally, batteries are really important around how we maintain storage, but also how we reduce bills for people by storing clean power, which we know is much cheaper in the long run. It minimises the investment in new generation. So actually, if we get the mix of batteries right alongside other renewable technologies, we can help minimise the need to build more infrastructure in the future because we store the power for when we need it. So it plays a really important role, and also a really important role in balancing the electricity system. We outlined in the Clean Power Action Plan that between 23 to 27 gigawatts of grid-scale batteries could be required to meet our decarbonisation goal by 2030. And not far from my constituency is one of Europe's largest battery parks, which was just announced recently. And so there is a sharing of some of this infrastructure across the whole of the UK. Turning to the points about solar, I actually agree with him on the point about rooftop solar. I think there is a real opportunity for rooftops. He rightly talked about warehouses. I think we've got a lot of multi-storey car parks, we've got a lot of factories, we've got a huge number of roofs in this country that I'm very happy to cover in solar panels. I think it's not an either-or. There is certainly a role for rooftop solar, and we've announced we want to see a rooftop revolution in solar. We've been working around how we bring forward new building standards so that new built houses and commercial buildings already have this as a key part of their design. But there is also a really critical role for ground-mounted solar as well. And I think if we can combine the two, we can meet our ambitions. And the Solar Task Force, which the previous government launched, in order to try and build out as much capacity in rooftop solar, but also to increase the number of ground-mounted solar, we have reconvened to try and bring together not just the issues about the rollout of that, but also how communities can benefit much better from hosting that infrastructure, and we look forward to publishing that soon. On two kind of final points on this, before I turn to small modular reactors briefly. On the food security point, I recognise the Honourable Gentleman makes this point, and a number of other members have as well. I want to be really clear that we take the view that food security is national security. It's critically important that we maintain the food security across the country. Even if we were to build out all of the solar that we currently expect to build, it would still take up less than 1% of the UK's agricultural land. And so we don't see this as competing priorities of food versus renewable energy. The two can coexist together. And this resilient and healthy food system that we all want to see, it also requires, and I think the Honourable Lady and the Honourable Gentleman both mentioned floodplains. Of course, tackling climate change is going to be one of the most important things to make sure we reduce the frequency of floods in areas like that. And that's also important for maintaining that arable farmland in the future. So we have to tackle the climate crisis if we want to maintain our food security, but we also want to ensure that there is a balanced view of what land use is used for. The Honourable Gentleman referenced the land use framework which was announced, I think, last week. And I think misleadingly, unsurprisingly perhaps for the Telegraph newspaper, far be it for me to say that, the figure used in that article suggested that all of that farmland would in fact be reused for renewable energy projects. That's not what the framework said. It said that there were a number of uses that land could come into around sustainability. So, for example, whether there are peatlands or particular environmental schemes that the land could be used for that helps lock in carbon, that develops a sustainable approach to biodiversity and wildlife, but also is helpful for us meeting our climate obligations. So it's not that the land is going to be used to build energy projects, as I think that article quite wrongly said. And finally, on the point on communities, we are determined that we bring communities with us in this. We want communities to have a voice. We want communities that host infrastructure to benefit from it. And so we will deliver a package of community benefits for communities. And on small modular reactors, just before I finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said at the beginning, we don't see this as one or the other. Nuclear will play a critically important role in our energy mix far beyond 2030. It provides a critical amount of baseload. It provides skills and well-paid jobs across the country. We want to see the SMR programme roll out. We inherited much of this from the previous government, not really progressed in the 14 years, with none of it built in that 14 years. We now want to move at pace to deliver that, and we do see nuclear as important, but alongside a balanced renewables system. And so can I conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by thanking the Honourable Gentleman again for bringing this debate. He and I think clearly will not agree on all of this, but I hope we can find a way to make sure that we build a resilient energy system that balances the needs of different communities, and particularly on the point around the cumulative impact, that we find a way through this so that all communities, yes, benefit from infrastructure, but some will have to host it as well. Thank you.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye? Aye. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.